All right, let's get right into it. So picture this. You've got a world that's, well, it's teetering on the absolute edge of chaos. Aggressive countries are just rewriting the map by force. But then you've got this rising industrial giant, America, that wants absolutely nothing to do with any of it. That, right there, was the American crossroads in the lead-up to World War II.
And really, that's the central tension we're going to explore here. I mean, on one side, you have this global fire that's starting to rage out of control. And on the other, a nation just dead set on staying out of it, looking inward and kind of hoping the whole storm would just pass them by.
And look, you just can't understand America's perspective without remembering this one crucial thing. The Great Depression was in full swing. The nation was, it was on its knees economically. People were focused on jobs, on food, on just surviving at home. Problems happening overseas, they felt like they were a million miles away. Okay, so Section 1, America Looks Inward. The subtitle here is The Fortress America Mindset, and that really says it all. We're going to dive into this dominant mood, this mindset of Fortress America. It was this deep desire to just build walls, both real and political, against all the world's problems.
So the official name for this whole approach was non-interventionism. And you have to remember, after the absolutely brutal experience of World War I, the thinking in Washington was crystal clear. Avoid getting tangled up in foreign messes at all costs. And this wasn't just, a preference. No, it was literally the law of the land written into a whole series of Neutrality Acts.
But here's where things get really interesting, right? You see this gap between the official policy and, well, the unofficial reality. Because while the government was officially hands-off, a lot of Americans were watching the newsreels, they were reading the papers, and they were getting seriously concerned about the rise of fascism and all this aggression happening overseas. There was this huge disconnect.
All right, let's pivot for a second. Section 2, The World Catches Fire, A Storm Gathers Abroad. Because while America was busy looking inward, the rest of the world was, well, it was spiraling out of control, and fast. That storm wasn't about to wait for America to get ready.
So the first big challenge really came out of the East. You had Japan, hungry for resources and territory, launching this absolutely brutal invasion of China. And just like that, any illusion of peace in Asia was completely shattered.
Then you look over to Europe and Africa, and you've got Mussolini's Italy starting its own expansion. They invade Ethiopia, they get involved in the Spanish Civil War, basically just flexing their military muscle for everyone to see.
And then, of course, the big one, the most ominous threat of them all. The rise of Nazi Germany. Hitler starts rearming the country, reclaiming territory, completely ignoring international treaties. He's setting Europe on a direct collision course with war. The fire was definitely spreading.
Which brings us to our next section, the limits of words, a response without weapons. All of this global aggression put the United States in a really, really tough spot. It was an impossible position, right? They had to respond somehow, but that whole policy of non-interventionism meant their hands were tied when it came to military action. So what could they even do?
And that was the fundamental question facing the Roosevelt administration. How do you condemn war without actually joining it? Or put another way, how do you stand up to bullies when you've already sworn you're not going to get into a fight? Well, the answer they came up with was to use diplomacy and economics as their weapons.
Okay, so the first tool they pulled out was diplomatic. It was called the Stimson Doctrine. And what it was, essentially, was a moral stand. The U.S. basically announced to the whole world, and they were looking right at Japan after its invasion of Manchuria, that they would not recognize any new borders that were drawn by force.
And that's the key right there. Boundary changes due to force, not recognized. It was a powerful statement of principle for sure, but it was just a statement. There was no military might to back it up. It was basically a line drawn in the sand with words, not with weapons.
So naturally, when it became pretty clear that words weren't going to stop any tanks or planes, the U.S. had to escalate. Now, because of those neutrality laws, they couldn't sell weapons to their allies, but they could stop selling the raw materials of war to the aggressors, and this became known as the moral embargo.
And this chart really shows you how it all escalated. You see, after the initial aggression, the U.S. puts a moral embargo on just a few select goods, things like aircraft parts. But then, when Japan invades Indochina, the U.S. expands that embargo list. They tighten the screws, adding more and more critical stuff like oil and scrap metal.
Which leads us to our final section, the unavoidable path, or the point of no return. See, this economic pressure created this kind of feedback loop. Every time there was an act of aggression, it was met with an even stronger American economic response. And this was pushing both nations down this unavoidable path, right toward a confrontation. So let's just trace this final, decisive chain of events. Step 1, Japan invades Indochina, right? They need resources. Step 2, the U.S. hits back by expanding the embargo to include oil. And that is a critical blow to Japan's war machine. And then, for Step 3, as a final move, the U.S. cuts Japan off from using the Panama Canal. That just severely messes with their trade and military logistics.
You can see how each of these responses pushed the U.S. further away from isolationism and closer to intervention. With every single step, that official policy of non-interventionism got harder and harder to stick to. America wasn't a passive observer anymore. It had chosen a side, not with soldiers, not yet anyway, but with its incredible economic power. That line between being neutral and being involved, it had blurred so much it was pretty much gone.
So let's just pull it all together. What are the big takeaways here? First, the Great Depression was a huge deal. It totally fueled America's desire to just be left alone. Second, when trouble did start, the U.S. didn't jump in with guns blazing. It responded first with diplomatic and economic tools. But third, all that escalating aggression overseas made neutrality pretty much impossible to maintain. And finally, and this is maybe the most important point, the path to war wasn't some single big decision. It was a whole series of reactions, one after another, that pulled the country closer and closer to the fight.
And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. With diplomacy failing and aggression just continuing to rise, was American intervention a choice? Or was it an inevitability? Was America simply backed into a corner where at the end of the day, there was no other choice left?